Well, for some analysis, we're now joined by independent political analyst Dr. Frederick Golooba-Mutebi. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you for inviting me to the show.
How important was it for Rwanda to host the CHOGM meeting as it's done?
Well, it was very important because, first of all, we have to remember that Rwanda is the youngest member of the Commonwealth, and therefore it wouldn't have been obvious that it would be granted the privilege of hosting this meeting just out of the blue. Secondly, Rwanda has never been a British colony. It's not an Anglophone country, although they have introduced English in this country. So both those factors would never have made it an obvious choice. But also, Rwanda has proved to be a very capable organizer of very large events. The Commonwealth is hardly the largest event that this country has hosted here in Kigali. So it has been able to prove that not only is it capable of organizing events of this kind, but that it is capable of organizing them to a very high standard. So I think that that would have been a key factor in influencing members of the Commonwealth in making the choice they made.
So, an important occasion, the world of the Commonwealth, 54 nations represented in some form or another. But there are some who say that Rwanda shouldn't have even been allowed to host it, given its human rights record. What's your take on that rhetoric? Because on the one hand, we see this story of a post-genocide Rwanda that's been a beacon of development, and yet on the other, we hear these stories, and a woman like Victoire Ingabire saying that, you know, it's all smoke and mirrors and PR, but that there's a serious human rights issue in the country.
I'm not sure that there are many people who live in this country that would agree with Victoire Ingabire's assessment. First of all, Victoire Ingabire was convicted of having committed crimes. She wasn't simply convicted because she was running for president. And then she was subsequently forgiven and released under presidential pardon. And since she was released, she is free in the country. She's free to meet journalists. She's free to make statements. No one has taken her back to jail. But also let me point this out, that if the Commonwealth made its decisions as to where the summits are held on the basis of a pure or a kind of perfect human rights record, I'm not sure how many of the 54 countries would qualify to host this summit. Rwanda is not perfect. There are issues here, but to kind of keep banging on about human rights violations, I think it's a bit of an exaggeration. There is a time when those charges would have been more justified than now, because it's only 28 years since the very great crime of genocide happened in this country. And in the early years of this government, I'm not sure that anybody should be expected that certain measures would have been taken that run counter to the observance of human rights in the conventional sense in which we would understand it. But I have been in this country for 22 years, and I have seen great improvements happening. The media are self-regulating. I hear claims of journalists being in prison. I'm not aware of a single case of a journalist who is in prison for journalism. They are in prison because they are facing other charges, unless somebody wants to argue that journalists should live above the values that guide the rest of us who live in this society. So yes, there are human rights issues in Rwanda, as they are indeed in any other country, but I think that there is a tendency to over-exaggerate that particular challenge.
She says that 9 members of a political party are in jail just for reading a book called Blueprint for Revolution. Is that true?
I'm not sure that it's true. And also, let's make this clear. Ingabire's party is not legal in this country. It has never been registered. There are standards that are set out here in Rwanda for registering political parties. There are conditions that have to be fulfilled. It has never fulfilled those conditions. She does not have a legal or registered political party in Rwanda. Now, about members of her party being in jail for reading a book, I find that rather surprising because there are a lot of books that have been written that are very critical of President Kagame personally, but also critical of his government, which are sold here in the bookshops. I have bought them, I have read them. No book has been banned from being sold in Rwanda. So whatever book she's referring to, I'm not aware of it. I've never seen it, I've never heard of it. So I don't think that that is true.
She also says that there's very little separation of power between the various arms of government, and that, for example, the justice system has been engineered in such a way that it does political missions, that it's not independent from the executive. Has that been your experience?
It is certainly not my experience. Let me give you an example which would contradict what she's saying. There has been a long-running debate between Rwanda and countries both in Europe and beyond, and even the rest of Africa, regarding people who live in those countries who are genocide suspects. Now, a lot of countries like Denmark, like Sweden, like the Netherlands have returned people here. Canada has returned people to Rwanda. The United States has done the same. There are others being pursued elsewhere in these countries. Those fugitives would never have been returned to Rwanda if the judiciary was structured in the way that Ms. Ingabire suggests, because Rwanda has been required to observe separation of powers, the independence of the judiciary to the highest standards before those countries agree to return those people to Rwanda. So I'm not sure what she's referring to exactly, but that's my understanding. It doesn't tally with hers.
Then there's the other issue of government has done, yes, a lot of development, but most of it has been in the urban areas, and that people in the rural areas are still living in abject poverty. And so much of what we see, again, she talks about putting on a certain face, PR to the world to create a certain view of Rwanda, whereas the majority of people, life isn't so much better.
I mean, in many ways, that is true. I'm not sure that the government of Rwanda has ever claimed that every Rwandan is wealthy or that there is no poverty in this country. I live here. I am a researcher. I do research in urban areas and rural areas. And yes, I have seen poverty. I have seen high levels of poverty, as I have seen in other countries, including your very own, Peter. I lived in and worked in South Africa for 4 years. I've seen poverty in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Uganda, in Congo. Rwanda is not unique in this, but I'll tell you why, where Rwanda does better than other countries. Rwanda has been tackling these challenges very effectively. They have built so many health centers across the country, so many new schools. They have built roads. They're making an effort to improve agriculture. So yes, there is poverty here, but the suggestion that somehow the government is not doing something about it, I think, is wrong. The other thing that I would tell you, if you look at poverty statistics, Rwanda has lifted over 1 million of its citizens out of poverty in recent years. If you look at Rwanda's mortality rates, infant mortality rates, you'd see that there has been a vast improvement over the last 28 years. So yes, there is poverty in Rwanda. There are areas where poverty is quite high. But yes, at the same time, there are great efforts that have been made by the government and that continue to fight poverty and lift people out of this intolerable situation.
All right, before we move on to other current issues, perhaps you can just contextualize it. Why then do we have these voices, a lot of them in exile, saying that, look, it's not all great in Rwanda. We can't say what we want to say. If we speak out, if we're critical, there's a likelihood that you will be disappeared, you will be arrested, some kind of sanction will befall you.
You know, I agree with those people who are making those statements on one point, that it's not all rosy here. As I pointed out to you, there is nothing that is perfect in this country. There are problems, there are challenges, and as I told you, the government has been working rather hard to address these problems. Again, I live here. There are so many radio stations in this country. There are political talk shows. People call in and criticize the government. There are many activists in this country who criticize the government. They are not in jail. There are people who have been arrested for the things that they have said. But what have they said? They have been engaging in genocide denial. They have been violating anti-genocide laws. So let's not pretend that somehow Rwanda is perfect or that it's supposed to be perfect. There are problems, but there are people who are jailed in this country for committing crimes, and then they politicize them. There are people outside Rwanda who are genocide fugitives who continue to campaign on the grounds of human rights. And actually, many of them style themselves as human rights activists. But actually, there are people who are running away from the law in Rwanda. And yes, let me emphasize this yet again. Rwanda does not claim to be a perfect country. The government here does not claim to be a perfect government. There are problems here. I know them. I have seen them. But at the same time, I think that there is a tendency to exaggerate what happens in this country in terms of negative reporting.
Oh, all right. A couple of other issues. M23, DRC. This has broken down relations between Kigali and Kinshasa. What is the story? How much involvement does Rwanda have in terms of the goings-on inside the DRC, and in particular the M23 rebels?
You know, Peter, I wouldn't tell you how or whether or if the government of Rwanda is involved with the M23. I have heard the same claims as you have heard, that the government of Rwanda is aiding these rebels. It may be not. I don't know. I'm not in a position to tell you that. But what I can tell you also, and what I don't hear enough of, is why groups like M23 have emerged in the DRC. Now, M23, which tends to be styled by a lot of people as a Tutsi movement, is actually not a Tutsi movement, although there are a lot of Tutsis and Rwandophones in it. Now, that group emerged because of violations of the rights of some of these groups in the DRC, especially the Kinyarwanda-speaking people. A lot of these people have their parents living as refugees in Rwanda. They have been dispossessed. They have been chased out of their country. And the crime that they are accused of is being speakers of Kinyarwanda, which is the language spoken in Rwanda. Now, what they have in common with Rwandans is that they speak the same language. But those are Congolese Kinyarwanda speakers who were placed in Congo by the demarcation of the borders during the period of colonial rule. So there are real issues that animate some of these movements, but sadly the media do not really highlight these things. Now, the DRC government did sign some agreements with M23, and these agreements have not been honored. So there is a sense in which M23 is fighting the DRC government on very strong grounds. Is it aided by Rwanda? I'm not sure. Does it have justified reasons for fighting? It seems to me as if it has.
All right, and perhaps finally, the asylum question. How is it being understood and taken inside Rwanda by Rwandans, and does Rwanda have the capacity to take on these refugees, asylum seekers who've been shipped out by Britain?
Our understanding, those of us who live here, who pay attention to these things, is that Britain is outsourcing a problem to Rwanda. Now, people, in my opinion, could be justified in criticizing Britain for abdicating its responsibility for these refugees. But as far as I understand what Rwanda is doing, the government of Rwanda is offering a solution. This is not unique at all. Rwanda has been receiving refugees from other countries. There is a whole group of Afghan girls here who left Afghanistan as refugees very recently. They came here, a school has been established for them. They are going to school in Rwanda. There is no problem. I haven't heard anyone criticizing that. The government of Rwanda evacuated hundreds, if not thousands, of African migrants from Libya who were being sold as slaves, who were being mistreated. They brought them to Rwanda, housed them, fed them. Some of them have left the country and gone on to other countries where their applications for political asylum have been accepted. Others have returned to their countries. Others have gone to neighboring countries, but others are still living here. So these people who are coming from Britain are going to be welcomed here in the same spirit, in that they are going to be here pending the processing of their applications for asylum. They will move on to other countries if their applications are successful. If they fail, they may choose to go back home. They may choose to settle here. There is no predetermined outcome as far as this is concerned. Now, is Rwanda able to afford this? No, Rwanda couldn't possibly afford this if it was going to use its own resources. But what has happened is the British government is accompanying these refugees with sums of money that are going to be used to look after them, to feed them, to house them, but also to offer them training. I really do get surprised as to what exactly people are criticizing Rwanda for.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and giving us another perspective on some of the issues that are currently doing the rounds in the media. Thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, that's political analyst Dr. Frederick Golooba-Mutebi giving us another take on some of the charges that have been put through to about Rwanda, human rights records, and of course the M23 question and asylum that's currently doing the rounds in the news.